Hi, welcome and good afternoon all. Welcome back to the latest iteration of the Current Events in Latin America lecture series at the University of Chicago. On behalf of UChicago's Center for Latin American Studies, my name is Ryan Jobson. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology, as well as a faculty affiliate in the Center for Latin American Studies, as well as the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture here at the University of Chicago. Our guest this afternoon, Mamira Prosper, is an assistant professor of global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on Black social movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, with a particular interest in Haiti. Prosper is currently working on a manuscript entitled Development Contested in Occupied Haiti, Social Movements, NGOs, and the Gangster State. She's also the international coordinator of the Pan-African Solidarity Network with community movement builders. And before I hand it over to Mamira, if I may, I should also add that I've been aware of Mamira's research for more than a decade now, if I'm not mistaken, from the Caribbean Studies Association annual conference in Curacao in 2011. I think that's the right year. And I've followed your work closely ever since. And I just wanted to sort of make a shout out to our audience to say that your recent writing in collaboration with Mark Schuller, another sort of scholar who I know and respect, in the NACLA report on mass protests and popular democracy in Haiti has been so deeply instructive, both to my research and teaching repertoire in Caribbean studies during my time here at Chicago. So it's a distinct pleasure to have you join us here virtually this afternoon or this morning on the West Coast to discuss your work at length. The title of Mamira's presentation today is Protests and Migration: Rejection of Right-Wing Authoritarianism and US Imperialism in Haiti. So with no further ado, Mamira.
Thank you, Ryan, for that wonderful introduction and for being my interlocutor today. And of course, for the invite by class to participate in this conversation. Well, it's going to be a bit of a lengthy presentation, but I really look forward to questions and also to conversing with you, Ryan. Okay. So as Ryan said, the title of the presentation today is Protests and Migration, Rejection of Right-Wing Authoritarianism and US Imperialism in Haiti. And so I begin the talk thinking about this, situating our conversation here, our discussion here in the United States, right? This past September, the US State Department of Homeland Security reported that more than 300,000 Haitians had reached the US-Mexico border in Del Rio, Texas. Among them were more than 10,000 Haitians. Citing health concerns, the administration of sitting President Democrat Joseph Biden, in which feature prominent Haitian American staffers, deported more than 5,000 of Haitians, right, those migrants back to Haiti, including children who had not been born in the Caribbean country. Many thousands retreated back to Mexico, with a few hundred receiving assistance from immigration rights activists and Christian missionaries to reunite with family members in Miami and New York. They were among more than 12,000 refugees the Department of Homeland Security claimed were released into the US. And Title 42 is this immigration legislation that was also employed by former US President Republican Donald Trump to justify deportation. And I'm sort of putting an accent, right, on the fact that Joe Biden is a Democrat versus Trump being a Republican, but yet we're seeing that their policies are very much the same. They're using the same laws specifically to target Haitians, right? And this is an ironic move, of course, given the millions of US Americans refusing to get the COVID vaccine, but reserve the right to travel unencumbered to US colonial holdings, thousands currently protesting, maybe a little less these days, government mandate, vaccine mandates, and the lifting of the eviction moratorium that will render millions of Americans, of US Americans and undocumented people, more houses, right? And it's not also novel with the US's long history, not only of depicting immigrants of color as dirty, but also designating Haitians in particular, the quintessential Black immigrant, as diseased. We can recall, for some of us, that Haitians, for much of the 1980s and 1990s, were scientifically recognized as carriers of the HIV virus. So liberal and conservative media have reproduced these same racialized tropes by focusing on the so-called flood of Haitians in particular. They also offered shallow perspectives presenting Haitians' presence at the US-Mexico border as new, while ignoring that Haitians had already been listed among the 8,000 people in this 2018 moment, right, the migrant caravans, alongside Nicaraguans, Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and even Angolans, Congolese, Cameroonians, and Bangladeshi who arrived in California only to be deported or interned, right, in overcrowded concentration camps, adding to the 2.3 million surplus populations already encaged in US territories, right? So, and mainstream news also linked Haitians migration with the de facto President Jovenel Moïse assassination in July and the earthquake in August, events that are too recent to have produced this current wave. And lastly, they traced the presence of Haitians at the border to the perpetual state of poverty of the country without offering any context, thus rendering poverty endemic, right, to the first Black Republic. And very few address the blatant racism that informed the differential treatment of Haitians who experienced deportation in greater numbers. So in this talk, I really want to challenge, take on these implied and overstated reductive narratives about immigrants desiring US freedoms, and instead contribute to what I would call a demystified analysis of Haitian migration to the North. Haitians do not choose to leave their homes. Instead, they are displaced because of land grabs organized by the colonial states and the local oligarchs to make way for extractivist projects like gold, copper, and other precious mineral mines, large plantations, industrial parks, and less so tourist compounds. These people are abandoned by the neoliberal state that provides subsidies to multinational companies as incentives for investment while taxing even the street vendors. And this authoritarian state was made possible through the US Embassy's control of Haiti's electoral process and supported by a 13-year United Nations military occupation headed by Brazil and Chile, the two destinations of Haitians in the 21st, the two new destinations of Haitians in the 21st century. So while I'm talking about Haiti, right, I'm also thinking about situating this Caribbean nation within the history of the region. I put up this slide. This is a documentary produced by some friends, some colleagues that try to capture this new migration wave coming out of Latin America into the United States, or attempting to come to the United States. And it really traces, the story of folks leaving Haiti, going to Brazil. Some end up in Chile and ending up at the US-Mexican border. So I invite you to look at it to get a sense of what that journey is like, because that's not going to be the focus of this conversation, but it's a way for me to talk about, right, the fact that as we saw this first caravan coming into the States in 2018 that included Haitians who had walked from Chile to 11 countries to join thousands of Central Americans on their way to Tijuana, at the same time, their compatriots in Haiti had organized the first Pays Loc, a general strike that eventually launched a wave of protests over the next 3 years. So the Pays Loc, I couldn't find images, right? Because this is an event that happened, as people understand it, spontaneously. But it was in reaction to the president, the one who was assassinated. I think that's on everybody's mind, and we're going to get to that part of the story, raising taxes on gas prices. And folks had reacted in this way by shutting down the country, right? And saying essentially, we disagree with this decision, we cannot afford this. But you have, by October, when the migrant caravans had reached the border, hundreds of thousands of Haitians were marching throughout multiple cities in the Caribbean country asking, where is the Petro Caribe money? Different sectors of Haitian society had gathered to demand the rendition of the Petro Caribe accounts since the agreement had been signed in 2008, or more than $2 billion of public monies earmarked for social projects such as housing, infrastructure, and agriculture. So I share some of the images. To the right, you have the little image with the man who has his eyes covered, right? This begins with some folks who are tweeting, using social media to put out their messaging. It goes viral, and you had folks already on the ground ready to take up this struggle under this banner. And essentially you have 3 years worth of protests and sit-ins, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And folks were really organizing and protesting to denounce state corruption and impunity. And some more radical militants called for a total rupture with the system of inequality and exploitation, where they were qualified as Chavi les, which is, to overthrow the system. And these protests really were an acute expression of the people's rejection of the core group imposed election of Jovenel Moïse. I'll talk about the core group and Jovenel Moïse's party, Parti Haïtien Tête Calée, that essentially came to power and following the 2010 earthquake. And people were essentially protesting what they called, the death plan of this party. But more broadly, these uprisings, like the migrations, were the Haitian people's response to almost 2 decades of state abandonment, military occupation, land dispossession, and the gangsterization of their neighborhoods, and of course, a much longer legacy of racial capitalism and imperialism in the Americas. I'm not going to play the whole video, but I want to show you how in this moment, this particular protest movement came to really rest upon many artists, visual artists, musicians, documentary filmmakers, etc., to push out the message, even more, and particularly targeting the diaspora that can't be on the ground. So I'll just share the video. It's also informing folks where the money had gone, which government had been responsible for distributing the money, receiving the money. We'll talk more about it later. But this is essentially the context for folks, if we're thinking on this side about the migration of Haitians, we're thinking about what's happening in Haiti. There are protests happening, and it's the same time frame, and people are responding to the same abandonment in very different ways, And so the video just is informing folks, and most importantly, it ends giving people a sense of how much they will owe, And after these folks have stolen all the money from the state, that the money still has to be repaid, and the Haitian people will be responsible for that via taxes. So the video ends on that note, giving a sense of how many generations it will take to pay for this debt. And so to understand really what the Petro Caribe agreement is, to understand this particular party that has been in power for 10 years, I want to take us back to the turn of the century to really give us an understanding of what's happened, that's produced the kinds of conditions that have not only, as I said, given us this protest movement since 2018, but also migrations of Haitians out of the country, even a decade before that, but accelerated particularly in 2016. So I hope you can bear with me with this history and some of the details, because I really hope that you get to have a better understanding of what's happening in Haiti. And the way that I think the media, as I said in the beginning, doesn't do justice, doesn't really make the connections, and certainly doesn't point to US imperialism as a feature of why we see what we see in Haiti. At the turn of the century, the interests of multiple state, corporate, and non-governmental actors from more than one nation state converged in Haiti. Textile merchants, presidential aspirants, discontented public university students, and right-wing paramilitary groups in the Caribbean country conspired with the US Department, led by nearly deceased Colin Powell, to force a democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to resign from power for the second time, a few weeks after the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution. On the eve of the bicentennial of the Revolution of 1804, Aristide had demanded that France repay the debt it had imposed on Haiti to recognize its independence, a debt the country reimbursed until 1947 to US banks that had absorbed the remainder of the sum during the US occupation of the Caribbean country between 1915 and 1934. By January 2004, this is right after Haiti has celebrated bicentennial, US industrialist and member of the local oligarchy, Andre Apped, who's holding the mic at the top, led what they eventually called the Groupe des 184, a coalition of so-called civil society organizations and individuals, and to usurp a student movement. Our students who had been requesting reform of the public university system and decrying the police response against their demonstration. They weren't necessarily calling for the overthrow of the government, but the Groupe des 184 usurps the discourse, controls the discourse, and essentially organizes folks into demanding that the democratically elected president step down from power. And additionally, you had former military and police officers in exile in the Dominican Republic, people who had been disgruntled when Aristide came back after the first coup d'etat in 1994 and disbanded the army that had deposed him. So these folks were in the Dominican Republic and descended especially upon Gonaïves, which is a city of independence that's about 2 hours from the capital, threatening to invade the capital. So all of these interests, right, converge in that moment that seemed to be disparate efforts, right, and led to the second coup against Aristide. And the Groupe des 184 enlisted the support of the Caribbean community, right? And, you know, CARICOM is seen as an inter-Caribbean political, economic entity, but very much is in the shadow of the US and controlled by the US in terms of what kind of trade agreements, right, Caribbean countries can make with one another. And so the Groupe des 184 managed to convince, of course, the United Nations Security Council to authorize a so-called peace mission of stabilization in Haiti and to establish the core group, which essentially is an international council that is composed of the US, Canada, France, the European Union, the United Nations, the Organization of American States, Germany, Spain, and Brazil. So essentially an international council to oversee the state. So we're talking about full-on colonialism here. But when we think about Haiti and we think about the way that the UN talks about these, you know, so-called peace missions, or we don't think of it as neocolonialism. And I'm not sure what else we could possibly call it, right? If in the United States you had foreign military on your ground, we would all be clear at least that it's an occupation. And Brazil, under a left-leaning president, Lula, essentially won the bid to head the military project, and with Chile, they provided over 5,000 troops at the beginning. And the US Embassy assumed a boldly visible leadership role in political affairs, and essentially this occupation sought to name Aristide's armed bases, especially in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area, and to control the electoral apparatus. That's one of the very most important mechanisms by which this neo-colonial project is able to be executed. And the troops raided Port-au-Prince, popular neighborhoods, and raped women and children. International non-governmental organizations also accompanied the mission, affording employment to some members of the small middle class, further distancing them from the jobless and the working poor. This new civilizing enterprise required a compliant state to maintain wages low, liberalize land ownership, subsidize imports, and ensure a docile citizenry. A Haitian American UN official was named to steward the transition. And you end up having eventually the organization of so-called free elections, again through the financing of the US, and compromise candidate René Préval was elected in 2006. In that same year, Haitian industrialists successfully lobbied US Congress to further extend the Caribbean Basin Initiative of 1983. So we're talking about, right, towards the end of the Cold War, right? These initiatives that are being taken by the United States and the Caribbean to ensure that as, right, folks are turning to potential models of development, right, that they're staying within the control and purview of the United States. So essentially, this law, which is called Hemispheric Opportunity Partnership Encouragement Act, and just really quickly, they just called it HOPE, the HOPE Act. It extends this initiative that's from another era, supposedly the Cold War, during which the United States, just to put it in a simple, very digestible way, is fighting against so-called communism that is impeding democracy, apparently. And this act establishes duty-free access from Haiti to the US of various apparel products for example, Gap, Walmart, Levi's, Zara. You have a series of other companies, the ones that we all go to, Old Navy, right, that where we buy our clothes. A lot of them are being made in Haiti. And Hope 2 in 2008 afforded those privileges also to the Dominican Republic as well. So you have Hope 1, 2006, Hope 2, 2008. And they're really thinking about the island as one, right? And much of the labor, the laborers who are working in these industrial factories in the Dominican Republic, there's one massive one, and I'll talk a little bit about it, at the border. They're Haitian workers who are there making these clothes as well, though it's in the officially considered Dominican factory. Meanwhile, minimum wages stayed stagnant. The US Embassy, now the most massive in the Americas and the third largest in the world at the time, this is the US Embassy in Haiti, thwarted all efforts by the Haitian parliament to raise minimum wages, and US rice continued to eclipse national production. And now you had Brazilian products, Brazilian bamboo products, pasta, vegetable oil, rice, milk, cheese, crackers, flooding Haitian markets. So with occupation, you don't just have a military presence, and through, again, right, the intensification of neoliberalism, right, liberalizing the markets, you have foreign products coming to compete with local production. So US rice essentially eclipsed Haitian rice, but you also have these other products, spaghettis, etc., that become staples, right, in the Haitian diet, and these are all imported foods. And so you see, again, the connection between occupation and neoliberalism in this moment and the role of Brazil. And this is exactly at the point that we start seeing the first wave of migration to Brazil, beginning in 2008, after the South American country won the bids for the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics. And Haitians were recruited as the cheapest labor force in the region to work on these construction projects. Now, Prival attempted to curb the effects of this occupation. He invited President Hugo Chavez to Haiti to sign the Petro-Caribe Agreement in 2008. And essentially, the Petro-Caribe Agreement is conceived in 2004, just a couple of years before the Haitians start migrating out of Haiti, right in this moment that Aristide has been deposed for the second time. And it's a regrouping of states and movements brought together by Cuba and Venezuela. The Petro-Caribe program offered preferential rates to Caribbean and Central American countries for the purchase of the hottest commodity on the planet, petroleum and its byproducts, thus encouraging trade between American nation states outside of the purview of the United States and Canada. And most importantly, Petro-Caribe, unlike IMF and World Bank loans, promoted the use of funds towards people-centered development, right, towards social programs, towards housing, etc. So this 2010 earthquake moment, right after you've had this coup in 2004 and the establishment of this neo-colonial project, right, military project, political project, economic project, you're going to have an earthquake. And that's really going to help to do what I call, right, the total recolonization of Haiti. And it presents a fortuitous opportunity for the United States. The US military is immediately called in to secure the borders and determine which countries could aid Haiti. Former US President Bill Clinton anointed himself as the head of the Interim Commission for the Reconstruction of Haiti to control over $12 billion of reconstruction funds unchecked. And this commission essentially superseded any other institutions of the Haitian state and suspended the constitution essentially. Global North non-governmental organizations spent too much of this money, this $12 billion, and there's several different documentaries that talk about where has the money gone. right? They spend too much of this money on their car rentals and private drivers, lavish housing, food at overpriced supermarkets, and psychological breaks at the best resorts in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Conversely, almost no housing was built in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area. And so to maintain its commitment to democracy and order in the region, I hope sometimes you can read the sarcasm in my tone. The core group, by means of the US Embassy, compelled the organization of elections, even while the citizenry was struggling to recover from this disaster, from this earthquake. Unwilling to risk the ascent of another challenger to its hegemony, the Northern Giant itself declared the results. And we could go into the details, but essentially this candidate on the left here with the glasses, the bald head, he was 5th in place in the first round and somehow is put in 2nd place by the 2nd round. And this is because the United States wanted it so, and this is essentially ushers him into victory. So Joseph Michel Martelly essentially establishes, the party was established slightly before the election, but he becomes the face of this party, which I translate into Haitian Party of Bald Heads. Ironically, many of the men who are members of this party are bald-headed, so I thought this was the best translation. And this party enjoyed the support of many Haitians living in the United States, and certainly a large contingent of the small middle class and the bourgeois living in Haiti. And PHTK clearly articulated the export-oriented model of development, the same one that the Duvaliers during the dictatorship, 30 years of dictatorship in Haiti, had promoted mining, tourism, agribusiness, and industrial parks. And so a new round of struggle ensued between the people of Haiti, their colonial state, and the imperialist powers. Within his first year of office, Martelly ordered the expulsion of the Chabelle community from their ancestral lands in the northeast of the country, an agricultural area unaffected by the earthquake, and funneled reconstruction funds to construct the largest industrial park in the Caribbean, Caracol Industrial Park. His government also violently evicted peasants from the Siguen Valley to make way for a touristic park. That same year, the survivors erected a collective tomb in the memory of the victims. The World Bank sponsored mining law 2013 was buried by his opponents in the parliament. Furthermore, peasants supported by progressive organizations frustrated plans to privatize La Vache, a small little island in the south, into an exclusive resort. In 2014, Martelly's government inaugurated the first agricultural free trade zone in Trou du Nord under future PHTK President Jovenel Moïse's supervision. So this president who was assassinated is a political unknown, an outsider, someone who before had never been involved in politics. And the way he rises to power is via supposedly the success of his agribusiness of bananas that is actually gifted to him just 1 year before the election through Martelly's party, right? So there's the making of an entire personality that doesn't really actually exist. And the aims of that is obviously in the hopes to control him. And we'll talk a little bit later about this dynamic between the members of this particular party vying for power. And I just wanted to highlight where the effects of this industrial park on the environment in the north of Haiti. So one thing we don't think about is the waste, right? The textile waste that comes out of the production of clothing. And I wanted to highlight that this is an extremely big concern for folks about these industrial parks that are producing clothes for us here in the United States. By 2015, another free trade zone was granted to one of the local oligarchs, the Port Lafito. And a free trade zone essentially is a space that is considered a sovereign, if you will, to the particular company or entity that controls it, and they don't pay taxes to the Haitian state. The free trade zone law was passed in 2002, and essentially it says, right, that people can be exonerated, exempt from taxation for up to 15 years. So imagine giving an entire port up to a local bourgeois, right, a capitalist who can circulate whatever they want in and out of the country, including guns. And these are one of 3 ports in the Caribbean capable of receiving ships that cross the Panama Canal into Asia. And this is very important in light of thinking about, Obama's turn to Asia in, 2008, 2009, and right, the role that this little Caribbean country can play in that process. There's only about 3, right, as I said, of these ports, and Haiti has one of them. During his administration, Martelly also delayed parliamentary elections to rule instead by decree, right? And this made it easier for him to pass these free trade zones and also raise taxes on the small, middle income and working poor classes. He did not condemn the UN troops for contaminated water sources that caused the cholera outbreak and the death of nearly 10,000 Haitians. He did not denounce the UN troops for raping hundreds of women and children, boys and girls included. He did not decry the Dominican Republic's repatriation of over 300,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent. And this is not surprising because the funding for his campaign came from a Dominican senator, right? So there are ways that he is bound to some, not critiquing the Dominican Republic. Instead, Martelly, his family, many of them with high-ranking positions, and his cronies squandered more than 2/3 of the Petro-Caribe funds. So this intentional abandonment of the population produced a very remarkable migration wave of fairly educated young people to Brazil, another wave in 2012, and increasingly to Chile since 2014 to work low-paying service and construction jobs. The next elections, 2015, were marred with fraud and irregularities. The result benefiting the PHDK candidate in the middle here, the political unknown. Organized civil society and political opposition shut down the country, forcing Martelly and the core group to concede to an interim government and the organization of new elections. Despite the devastating effects of Hurricane Matthew on the electoral infrastructure, another election took place in 2016, this time with more than 40% of the votes cast by zombies. And so essentially what this party did was take the electoral cards of people who were dead and to have them, right, to vote for this particular candidate. So 40% of the votes are coming from non-living people, resulting in Jovenel Moise's candidacy to the presidency in 2017. So I say this to, sort of prepare for the conversation that we're going to have about how could this sitting president be assassinated and who killed him, etc. And I want to make sure that we understand who he is from the very beginning, right? Already an invention of this party, somebody already highly contested, and the elections that finally put him into power are highly contested and suspicious. Haiti's Latin American occupation lasted 13 years, ending in 2017 when Moise comes to power and India took the lead of the UN mission. So just to think about some of the geopolitics here, right, in terms of who gets to occupy Haiti, who gets to control Haiti, how that plays into these countries' ability to also ascend, right, to different positions, like, for example, becoming part of the G20 and, gaining more global power. And, that's something we can unpack together as well if folks are interested in that scale of the conversation. The Brazilian and Chilean left-wing governments that once had received Haitian migrants as low-paid workers were replaced by right-wing authoritarians whose anti-Haitianism and general xenophobia served as a response to economic downturn, prompting thousands of Haitians to take that 4-month journey to the US-Mexico border, right? So I'm hoping that I'm putting this picture together for you to understand both protest and migration happening at the same time. Before the end of the year 2017, the opposition launched a first investigation into the uses of the Petro-Caribe funds. January 2018, Moise withdraws from the Petro-Caribe agreement, right after all this pressure. The United States is extremely invested, right, since under Obama, that the biggest threat in the region is Venezuela, and Petro-Caribe is something that they must absolutely undermine, right, and crash. And so you start seeing all these sanctions, and what happens is that many of the Caribbean countries who owed Venezuela were not able to repay because the US interdicted anybody trading with Venezuela to use the US dollar. So now that Venezuela is not able to receive, right, money that is owed to it in order for it to function. So this is, I have an article where I talk about the uses of Haiti and this struggle between the United States and, the alternatives proposed by countries like Cuba and Venezuela. So, and brings us back to the initial story about how, right, if he withdraws from the Petro-Caribe agreement, all of the benefits of the Petro-Caribe agreement disappear. And so now he has to hike fuel taxes in order to meet, right, the new demands of importing on the free market, right, petroleum, as opposed to the ways that Venezuela would allow Haiti to buy without paying, right, and give Haiti a significant amount of time, not just Haiti, other Caribbean countries to pay back. And parts of the loan were that you didn't have to pay back for 25 years, right? And it was at very low interest. So with withdrawing from the Petro-Caribe agreement meant that all those benefits were gone. So Moise decides to hike up the price. And as I said, the people shut down for 3 days and they blockaded all trading routes. And then you see, right, this movement that I talked about earlier under the hashtag, where is the Petro-Caribe money, really taking full force. And over the next 3 years, right, thousands of people are protesting at least once a month in several major cities of the country. And you have as a response, and people say, right, that there's no way to officially, without certain proof, link Moise's second version of the PHTK government with the gangs. However, what we can do is sort of, make these connections. If there is a massacre taking place, right, and during the daytime, where 71 people are being butchered in the street, women are being collectively raped, up to 11 women and children in this neighborhood in downtown Port-au-Prince, and the police is around and knows about it. Right, the government has some amount of responsibility, particularly by the time that we see Jovenel is saying that nothing happens in the country without his say-so. And also the fact that there's complete silence about it. Jovenel Moise and just, like the de facto prime minister today, they tweet everything that comes to their mind, right? He's tweeting about absolutely everything, but somehow misses this massive massacre in terms of at least presenting some kind of condolences to the families. The social movements continue to mount pressure for the Court of Audits, and there's a report that's produced in January 2019 on the uses of the Petro-Caribe funds, and this president is named as one of the many PHTK, his party adherents, in the embezzlement scheme, right? So you have somebody who is politically unknown, who's completely invented as a candidate, who steals the election, also being named in this big scandal. So at that same month, Moise votes in the OAS against the recognition of Nicolas Maduro as the president of Venezuela. So we continue to see how PHTK, in particular Moise, right, are tools of the United States to further undermine the Bolivarian revolution. In February 2019, organized militants started demanding the resignation of Moise to face justice. They say, if you're the first, first citizen of the nation, supposedly, you should lead by example, right? Step down, face justice. But yeah, you have the core group, right? This international council that continues to applaud this state, that continues to applaud the Haitian National Police officers, even after they've murdered and injured dozens of protesters. Moise remains in power. He reestablishes the Haitian armed forces, right? And you have several different general strikes and shutdowns that happened through the spring. More sectors of the population are joining the struggle, journalists, lawyers, doctors. But nevertheless, by January 2020, and I'm leading us to this timeline to get to the assassination, Moise is ruling on his own, with the mandates of the entire Chamber of Deputies and 2/3 of the Senate having been expired because, again, like his predecessor, he delayed parliamentary elections. So he is in full control of the state apparatus, right? He and his cabinet. In May 2020, 13 gang leaders formed the G9, led by this man who's on our screen right now, to coordinate attacks in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area. By the end of the year, Moise decreed the creation of a national agency of intelligence to collect information on militants and the criminalization of protest actions such as burning tires. Meanwhile, the gangs are tweeting about their unobstructed activities, kidnappings, massacres, and rapes. And the core group is attributing a decrease in murders to the Federation of Gangs, right? So this is really scandalous, right? When we get, by the time that we're in May 2020, we have a clear, there's clearly no democracy, right, taking place there. You have this international council and their puppet and control with the armed gangs, who are really the ones determining what's to happen in the country. Moise declares himself second in command after God, while his National Commission for Disarmament, Dismantling, and Reintegration claims that 35% of the territory is under the control of armed gangs and paramilitary groups, and more than 500,000 illegal weapons are in circulation, probably coming from that free trade zone port I mentioned earlier that was established in 2015. Human rights reports, including those by foundations, the United Nations itself, and the Harvard Law Clinic, confirmed the deductions of the Haitian people that the Moise government is run by death squads. So you have all these important international institutions confirming, right, Haitian suspicions that Moise is very much in charge of these armed gangs, right, or is in some kind of partnership with them. And of course, you know, international reports did not emphasize the failure of the 2-decade UN mission to establish peace in the country. Because if you look at the timeline I'm building, 2004 to 2021, 2022, when the territory is controlled by gangs, it has been under the UN mission's watch, right? So clearly there's a connection here with the so-called failure. In January 2021, Moise announced a referendum for a new constitution in the spring and elections for the fall. Drafted by the United Nations, the new law of the land limits the powers of the legislative branch while increasing the role of the executive, allows for consecutive presidential terms, and affords non-Haitian nationals the right to vote and hold office. On February 7th, which is the day that usually power is, you know, transitions from one hand to another, Moise became the de facto president of Haiti, having exceeded the term of whoever would have been the victor of a free and fair election in 2015. The following day, he issued a decree retiring Supreme Court judges and high-ranking police officials he claimed had organized a coup d'etat against him. This same decree transformed more than 25,000 hectares of protected agricultural lands of Salandian into a free trade zone managed by the Groupe des 184 APED. And this is the same guy that we see in 2004 who leads the coup, the second coup against Aristide. And he is essentially given these thousands of hectares of land to set up a plantation of a non-edible crop, stevia, towards the production of a sweetener for Coca-Cola. By the end of that month, the Protestant sector announced a march. All sectors of civil society answered en masse. Different sectors of society, including Protestants and some private sector groups, had joined social movements to demand that Jovenel step down from power. They also rejected Moise's referendum to change the current constitution that would expand the powers of the executive, allowing him to run for a consecutive term and absolve himself from facing justice once out of power. The international community's support for Moise began to wane, especially after social movements in other countries in America amplified the demands of the Haitian people. In early June, we're talking about 2020, the United States announced the annulment of the referendum after a meeting at the UN with Prime Minister Claude Joseph. On the ground, Moise went ahead with his plans. Moise's death followed recent decisions that have undoubtedly altered the power structure. So now I know that one of the questions here was to say, well, what happened, right? Why this violence? And we're, you know, sort of only concerned when it happens to the president. Of course, I understand, right, as the first nation, as the first citizen of the nation, why this is concerning, but it's really an extension of state violence that we were seeing on the ground via the massacres, the kidnappings, and the rapes. But we also see this as a power struggle within the party and within also the oligarchs, right, who were aligning themselves with one or the other faction of this party. So less than 2 weeks before his assassination, the Court of Auditors exonerated some key members of the party from the Petro-Caribe scandal, including Michel Martelly's former prime minister, Laurent Lamotte, who had been whitewashing his image internationally. He has some book that came out recently about how he reconstructed Haiti in 900 something days. And I'm still waiting to see evidence of this reconstruction. Moïse also issued a presidential decree exempting all ministers who served from 1991 to 2017 to allow for their reappointment. Some pundits allege that Moïse was paving the way for a Lamotte presidency against Martelly, who had always ensured his return, indicating a fracture within the party. Furthermore, although Moïse gave away thousands of acres of land to local industrialists under the appel of the Groupe de 184 to establish and manage the stevia plantation for Coca-Cola, the Court of Audits issued an arrest warrant against Reginald Boulos, also a member of the opposition and also a member of the oligarchy, for the misuse of public funds, pointing to a power struggle among the oligarchs. So you have all of these dynamics being at play in June, right before the assassination. There was also a trip that Moïse took to Turkey, during which people suspected that he was trying to engage in some kind of diplomatic relations with Russia, right? So you have all of this happening in the background just before the assassination. And you can see, if you trace Moïse's speech making, how much he is becoming bolder over time, especially by the time you see him in 2020. He says, no one's more powerful than he is in this country, right? And he is directing his speeches as some members of the oligarchy. And some people, Black nationalists, might want to see him as somebody who is essentially standing up to what has been traditionally a US quote unquote mulatto, lighter skinned / white elite. And yet he's giving these same elites, right, or fractions of this elite, thousands of acres of land, right? So there's a contradiction clearly there. But what we do see is an emboldened person, as opposed to the person we see in the beginning, who's very shy, right, who's being asked to come onto stage by his predecessor. And, essentially, this is not the same person, right? So you have these dynamics. There's also Claude Joseph, another character, his prime minister that he was about to replace, right? Who quickly somehow knew the details about the assassination and decides that, he's the one who's going to take over because he's prime minister. But Moïse had just appointed the new prime minister, Ariel Henry, the person who today occupies I had a picture of him that didn't make it, who's taken office after the de facto president's death. And we have to note that none of these nominations are legitimate, as there is no permanent parliament to ratify them. Furthermore, the claim that the gunmen spoke Spanish, were made in Joseph's statement just hours after Moïse's death, essentially shifting the blame to foreign mercenaries. Of course, international interference in national affairs of Haiti is not unreasonable, right? The prompt occupation proposal of Colombia gave some pause. US involvement is also possible, although in general, the superpower, regardless of which party is in power, is less concerned about who carries out its policies in Haiti. And we see that, right? They just sort of moved right on to Ariel Henry, because this party essentially is composed of folks who are willing to do their bidding. But what is clear is that Moïse's murder was not an overthrow of the people who, despite how the international media subtly diminished their protests, right, never really killed anyone. And so I'm not sure where I am for time, but I'll stop there. And, I think we can engage some of the many things that I've said. But one of the things, that I want you to walk away with is that, right, this violent occupation in Haiti has ensured the suppression of minimum wages, upholding Haitians as the cheapest and most disposable labor source in their own country, but also throughout the region. And this racial capitalist logic has operated in the Americas over the past 500-600 years, right? 500 years, with Black bodies in general reduced to flesh. And since the end of African-based slavery in the 19th century and the US recolonization of the Caribbean in the early 20th century, Haitians have been forced at the bottom of the labor pool, circulated on plantations at home and other US holdings or colonies. And in the 21st century, this logic persists even among so-called progressive governments of the global South, also vying for white supremacy in the region and the world. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments, Ryan, questions, and whatever is on the mind of the audience that they want to engage on. I know I've said a lot. I think I went over my time, quite possibly too.
Well, I believe we still have at least, or just under half an hour for Q&A. So at this point, I'll invite anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question to enter it into the chat, but I'll open with a few questions for Mamira to get the ball rolling as we assemble a queue of questions from our other attendees. So really just first, thank you for that fantastic genealogy of the political present in Haiti, which I think is so useful both for sort of our intellectual community and just for the discussions that we're able to have today. I guess one prevailing thread that I would love to hear you speak a bit more about is the way that you discuss how sort of poverty, crisis, violence, insécurité in Haiti is sort of regarded as exceptional. So both the way that Haiti is invoked as the poorest country in the hemisphere, as well as natural and endemic. And I'm thinking of a short essay by one of our sort of late UChicago colleagues, Rolf Trio, The Odd and the Ordinary, where he talks about sort of what it means to take seriously Haiti as an ordinary landscape rather than one that's sort of an exception to the rule. So all of that to say, what does it mean to view the hemisphere from the perspective of Haiti, to see these borders, deportations, coups, crises as ordinary rather than exceptional? I think more broadly, like, how do these anti-Haitian policies represent an ordinary condition, of US neoliberal governance rather than a departure from these sort of normative ideals of democracy, freedom, and citizenship? And we see the way that these keywords are being mobilized again to justify interventionism. So I'm wondering, how does that look from Haiti? How does Haiti sort of allow us to understand those norms differently, the actual substance of those norms different?
Right. Thank you for that question and for bringing up Rolf Tuyo, who certainly has made his mark in several different disciplines and using Haiti, among other Caribbean spaces, right, to tell the story of racial capitalism, even though he's not using, right, that concept at the time. But I think what Haiti helps us to see, and I hope, I did some of that work in the presentation, is how the system is really global, first of all, right, and has particular regional manifestations. And Haiti isn't, people tend to think that what it's missing is that it's missing capitalism, right? That it's not capitalist enough. And somehow, this is what makes it quote unquote backwards, rather than thinking about how Haiti has been made to occupy this position, this role, in order to prop up racial capitalism as a regional and global system, that it's very much by design. It's not some kind of thing that's endemic to the Haitian people's inability to supposedly, right, develop or progress, but that this is manufactured, right, by several different, what I call multicultural, right, actors. In the 2010 moment, we're seeing that it's the US, right, and we're talking about white, Black, Latinx people who are representing empire, right? We're talking about Colin Powell, right? This is happening also under Obama. So we have these folks who are representing US empire, but you have the local oligarchy. And you also need, right, the state has been, and throughout the history of, capitalism, instrumental in making capitalism possible and grow. And even though the neoliberal plan says that the state should retreat, it very much is, right, involved in making the market succeed, quote unquote, right, for those who benefit from it. And the Haitian state has been understood as failed, right? And even Tuyo pushes back against that. It's not failed. It is designed to function, right, as a predator. It is designed to abandon people, and it's designed to also facilitate land dispossession. That when you take people away from their land and from their ability to determine who they want to be and to also just do something basic like produce food, right? And then you take their land away to make other major extractivist projects, or sometimes you just let the land, stay there, right, and do nothing. It's to force these people into this process of, right, proletarianization, and my accent comes out in that word, right, so that they can become, right, potential laborers. And people say the solution for Haiti is jobs. There are not enough jobs that are going to actually be provided. That is part of the model. And again, like you said, Ryan, that we're fed to think that there's enough for everyone, but it's designed to actually create edge populations that sort of stay and wait, right? They're pending, waiting for this supposed labor, or in the case of the states, right, the arguments that abolitionists make, right, that this is part of why they get funneled into the prisons, right? That, Haiti for us, for me, right, is not just about talking about the struggles there, which are important, right, as an anthropologist, right, to show the local, but how it's really in conversation with empire, imperialism, racial capitalism, and Haiti's role is to keep wages low. Haitians are being paid the lowest minimum wage in the region, and that helps essentially, right, as the bottom of this hierarchy of wages, right? So it's not by mistake, it's by design, and it's not in isolation, but very much the Haitians producing Walmart clothing are in a direct relationship with people at Walmart who are selling, right, the clothing, who still are, right, battling with Walmart to pay them fairly, right? We're in the middle of a fight for 15 right now throughout the United States. Fight for 15 per hour, and the Haitians are in a fight for 15 per day, right? And so we can see again through unpacking what's happening in Haiti, really, it's also a story about US empire. It's also a story about struggles, right, in the United States. I went on. I feel like I touched, on your questions, that you said something about borders, right? We take borders for granted as if they're natural. And we think of the US, right? A certain number of states from coast to coast. And really, we need to think about the US as empire. That even at the beginning of its conception, it's already, right, imperialist, and it continues to need more territory, right? There are 800 military bases throughout the planet that the US controls, right? That its logic is to continue to expand and to cover the planet. And certainly Haiti is not outside of its purview. That it's not for lack of US intervention that Haiti is where it is. It's actually because there's been too much of it for the last 110 years.
No, that's an excellent answer that I think speaks exactly to what I hoped you could illuminate for us. And I have a related question that I think both is sort of drawn from your presentation today, and I guess your sort of manuscript in progress. So I'm really interested in what's at stake in naming what you call the gangster state, as distinct, for instance, from a failed state. But also I think there's something interesting, I only know your title from your bio, but there's an interesting slippage here that if this is about occupied Haiti, does the gangster state refer to Haiti? Does it refer to the US? Does it refer to both? Mm-hmm. And really what's at stake in naming the state as a gangster state, rather than simply, as I'm sort of familiar with in the Anglophone Caribbean, a state that's understood to sustain itself through alliances or clientelist patronage toward, dons and various sort of, criminal or gang organizations in garrison communities, but rather to name the state as such, as a gangster state, which I think is a bit different. So I'd love to hear you talk about where that thinking is going in the manuscripts, and any way that it relates to the talk from today.
Absolutely. So, when you're writing that title, you're trying to capture absolutely everything you intend to unpack, right? At first, the title has had many iterations, and always like, what's this adjective that I'm going to put in front of the state, right? Because I think failed state doesn't capture it. It's not at all my argument, or the argument of many folks, right, who talk about neoliberalism, in fact, as recolonization in the Caribbean, right? So we see, again, the role of the state as one that is designed to function as we see it functioning. So in Haiti, it's not that it's failed, It's doing actually exactly what it's supposed to do. It's quite successful at doing that. The reason I use gangster is because the PHTK in particular, when they come up in 2010, Michel Martelly is a pop singer, a pop compas singer, and his 2008 album is entitled Legal Bandit. So gangster sounds a little better than bandit, right? But the idea is, you know, his whole video is that he has this mafia style thing and he's with his boys and they're smoking their cigars and they're above the law, right? And this is his, you know, public personality. This is his performing, you know, this is his performative personality that he definitely brings with him to the presidency. This is how he runs his entire campaign, is using, and he had been, you know, he had to have other albums where he called himself president for life, right? Like one decade before. So he's very much using this legal bandit framework, a bad boy image to present himself, right? And his crew, right? This is how they're above the law. They can do whatever they want. They're cool, right? And so this is part of why I'm using gangster, right? Because it's literally coming out of his own mouth, right? In terms of how he's characterizing himself and his party. And we see the sort of gangster behavior, misogynist behavior that comes out of his party, even when he's campaigning. Or rather, he's just doing, he wasn't campaigning, he was out and about, you know, doing speeches. And there's a woman in the crowd who challenges him. And she, you know, and says, what have you done? Like during this whole time you've been president. And he says, you must not have a man, which is why you're up here asking these questions, right? This is the president. It sounds a little like Trump, right? This is the president of the country who tells a woman who is critiquing his failures, right? Which are actually successes to him because he's created all these free trade zones for the oligarch, right? He's facilitated the scramble for Haiti. And he attacks her in these misogynistic ways. He goes after journalists as well, right? He even makes a carnival song about one of the leftist journalists, essentially promoting sexual violence against her. But we see also throughout the PHTK's rise to power that, again, 500,000 guns are in circulation, right? The government knows that there's 500,000 guns, but they have no idea how they got here, right? No one knows how they got here, but we know how many are in circulation. And you're going to see by the time that you get to the PHTK version 2 with Moise, that the gangsters, who are literally calling themselves, right, members of gangs, have overtaken the metropolitan area, which holds about 1/3 of the population of the country. And they essentially run neighborhoods that have up to 300,000 people in them, right? And these folks are always part of the state apparatus where if you're a candidate running for office, for presidency, including Martelly and Moise, you have to go to these gang leaders and meet with them in order to get them to have the population, right, the territory they cover, to come vote for you in a particular direction. So there's already been this relationship, right, between the state, quote unquote, you know, with the gangs in terms of getting the votes, but also using them as an armed wing. We should probably rename them paramilitaries, right, to literally scare people, terrorize people via these massacres, kidnappings. And we saw there was a moment in 2021 where people just really stopped protesting because people are afraid, right? And there's general insecurity in the country that's run and facilitated by these gangs who, again, you have a national agency that's collecting information on activists, but you don't know where to find the gang member who just tweeted from his phone about some activity he just ran, right? So you can clearly see that the state relies on these folks, right, to maintain the citizenry docile in order for it to continue to do its work. So that part of using the gangsters, hoping to make all these connections and show very much that the state is an authoritarian state, right? And you know, we can get into the politics of it, but has no legitimacy, right, at all with the people, has no mandate, and relies on these folks. Even, there's a controversy because some folks in the diaspora are trying to portray these gang leaders as revolutionaries, because their discourse, right, sounds very much like, we're doing this for the people, but yet who are they massacring? Are their own neighbors, right? Or the rival gangs, the folks who live on their territories. And if you look at the struggle between the gangsters and what territories they cover, you can also see a struggle between the different oligarchs who are probably giving them the guns, right? Trade routes that are being controlled by one gang that line up with one particular oligarch's, right? Industry, right? Or territory that they cover. So you can also see how the state, I'm hoping to use it not just to mean, right, the people who are supposedly elected, right, but as a tool in the hands of the international and certainly also the local transnational. They're local, but they're also transnational, right, elite in Haiti. So like long-winded answer to your question.
I have one other related question, and there's a slide that you sort of referenced briefly where Lula makes an appearance as one of the many sort of architects of the sort of UN occupation of Haiti. And I was wondering, so I asked a question about sort of how the hemisphere looks from the perspective of Haiti. And I think implicitly, I was asking about sort of how the US appears from Haiti. But there's also this question of how does, this is, the Center for Latin American Studies, sort of how does the pink tide, how does this sort of wave of social democratic governments in Latin America, in South America in particular, appear from Haiti when, for instance, a figure like Lula is complicit in, the violations of Haiti's sovereignty. And I would say even to extend that, the entire Petrocaribe challenge, despite, or the protests, despite the sort of relative, sort of graciousness of Chavez regime toward the Caribbean, did seem to also make a mistake of forging a compact with the gangster state rather than with the Haitian people, that they created a situation in which these funds were able to be embezzled. So there's a way that the ambivalences of the pink tide come into sharper focus from a place like Haiti, particularly around this, I guess, the state form and how these different compacts are managed. So I was just wondering if there's a way we can shift the lens, I guess, southward, I guess, as well as toward Cuba, but just to think about how this entire wave of social democracy appears from Haiti alongside the neoliberalism of the US.
That's a great question. I remember giving a talk about the Pito Challenge, and clearly, if you haven't caught it, I'm a leftist, right? And some folks who are, much more supportive of Lula were like, well, the UN troops, the Brazilian UN troops are just puppets of the imperialists. And I was like, well, I disagree, because like you said, the way it feels, right, to Haitians on the ground is that very much Brazilians were occupying them. And today in 2021, 2022, you had more Latin American leftists come out much more clearly. And because of course, there's still, Lula's trying to reemerge, right? But the Lula era seems to have, to be gone, right? That now they can critique him. And they're honestly writing about, right, what I said here in the talk, a Latin American occupation of Haiti, right? And coming to terms with how even the left in these countries, right, had supported this, these missions, right? So again, you have in Haiti, and I look at social movements, left-leaning social movement, there's always this very complicated way, right? There's Lula, the person, the leftist, who was very progressive and, in some respects in Brazil, right, that the Haitians respect. And then there's the, well, but Brazil occupied us, right? Sort of a split between Lula, the person who's in charge at the moment that Brazil is occupying. And I remember meeting some Black Brazilian activists who were like, look, we told our leftists, our white leftist comrades that we disagreed with this occupation because it was clear to us what it was, right? But from Haiti, you really, really problematize, to use one of our favorite anchor words, right? South-South relations. That this idea that there's equality, right? This idea that you know, a global South country couldn't have any sort of imperialist intentions, right, towards another, I think really is exposed in the case of Haiti, where you have these left-leaning governments in Chile and Brazil at the moment being completely complicit, right, with the occupation of Haiti and with allowing, right, the US to remain hegemonic, right, in that sense. I think Cuba and Venezuela are slightly different in terms of, and I agree with you, right, that at any point, the Venezuelan state could have said, we're gonna stop interacting with these different states. I believe, you know, and I don't have the quote specifically of in the year, right, that they understood that they were doing this for the Haitian people, right? But I think also Venezuela was courting all the Caribbean nations who are part of the Organization of American States to make sure that diplomatically they continued to be recognized. So they were willing to indirectly support this gangster state, right? In hopes that it would turn into votes, you know, and the OAS. And Haiti betrays Venezuela in 2019 when Moise says, I don't recognize, right, Nicolas Maduro. So their gamble didn't quite go the way that they hoped. In the case of Cuba, you know, and Chavez has been, you know, Chavez denounced 2004, Chavez called out 2010 earthquake, right, as colonization. So there are these, you know, contradictions in what Venezuela is doing in relation to Haiti. In the case of Cuba, the Cubans, essentially their relationship with Haiti has been very much in the form of sending Cuban doctors, right? And so this is part of how they do their work, right? Of you know, building friendships with their neighbors, right? So that's a much more digestible type of South-South relation, one that we can commend. And, you know, I think recently people are starting to be a little upset at Cuba because, you know, a new Cuban president had said something to the effect that the international community has to come to contribute funds to the reconstruction of Haiti after the August 2021 earthquake. And everyone's like, wait, did you miss the 2010 moment when $12 billion just disappeared? And, you know, again, these countries are not also without their own sort of agenda to diplomatically be able to be recognized, right? And to, you know, to stop the war against them. So it's a complicated picture. And from Haiti's perspective, again, and I said this at the end, right, that even so-called friends of Haiti, even global South countries, right, who are vying for some version of like white supremacy and hegemony in the region, view Haiti also as a tool to do that. So Haiti, even among those we would think would be in solidarity with it, with the Haitian people, is usually seen, right, similarly to how the US has seen it, to be able to acquire and maintain power.
In the, I guess, few minutes we have left, I was going to introduce a question that we have in the chat that relates to, I guess, contemporary activism surrounding the situation in Haiti. So the question reads, given the impossibility of influencing the US government, or I guess we can debate how possible or impossible it is,
right.
How do we work together with Haitian groups on the ground in Haiti? How do we build networks at a time like this?
That's a great question. So academia is my day job, right? No, but I also participate, you know, in different organizations that are based in the US who try to be in solidarity with, you know, other people struggling all over the world, but particularly Haiti. So we organized in 2021 several different protests, right, throughout the United States, throughout Latin America. And, you know, as Latouk Makandal here is saying in the questions, it didn't seem to influence much, even though some of us like to think that we stopped this referendum, you know, to change the Constitution, because it put some amount of pressure on the core group you know, in the different countries that are in the core group, right, to back away from changing the law of the land, which of course is imperfect, but people, you know, thought it should come from a popular direction rather than top down from this president who's de facto who nobody ever even voted for in the first place, right? So I think, you know, coming back to the piece that I hope everybody heard, right, is the uses of Haiti and maintaining minimum wages low and the 4 axes of development. I think some of the ways that we can effectuate change, you know, at a global scale in particular that can have, you know, positive effects in the long run for Haiti is to think about our consumption, right? And is to think about our participation in driving the machine, right? That how much are we shopping? Are we buying these clothes, right? That we are making the system function because we are consuming what is producing without questioning, right? So I think these are the ways that also you can make things move in the United States, right? I'm not saying necessarily calling for a boycott, but once you start touching, right, the capitalists' money, right, then they start also, you know, calling on the state to provide certain benefits for people, right? So I'm just thinking that there's a way we in the US can do more than just, you know, send money or, you know, retweet something that's happening in Haiti, but actually change the system from here, right? And really challenge our faith that, right, we're only going to grow, it's only going to get better, you know, climate change shouldn't stop us from continuing the exact same thing that we've been doing that's been destroying the planet and people. I think it's a moment to re-question ourselves, our way of life in the United States, and to organize to do that work, because US is empire, right? 800 bases throughout the world. If something changes here, it definitely will have, right? Even if it's painful at the beginning, right? But long-term positive effects elsewhere. That's what I could say, really. This is what I've been saying most of the time. I know it's like a hard thing to tell people, you know, sew your own clothes, or like maybe you buy once a year and you're not at the mall every weekend, right? But that you're driving this machine by giving your few little savings out to consume, right, these commodities that we're told that we should desire, without thinking about who's producing them, right? And what kind of life is being lost behind the production of this commodity, including also oil, you know? We could go there, but.
I would love to go there, but unfortunately we're out of time. I may have to follow up with you after, Mamira, but because we're out of time, I want to thank you again for joining us virtually on a Wednesday morning out in Southern California. And also a special thank you to Ben, Natalie, and Mario for organizing this event and staging this conversation and providing technical assistance, as well as, you know, thank you to everyone in the audience for joining and participating today. Yes. Thank you again.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you, Ryan, for your wonderful questions. And yeah, I look forward to whatever we will all do together in the future.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.